Hello, my name is Melodie Bissell. I am the Chair and Senior Safeguarding Consultant at Plan to Protect. And it is my pleasure today to invite actually two of my three children to join us for this podcast. Victoria, or Tori, will be on the camera, and Joshua is our production editor for the podcast, and he might join in later on. But I'm pleased to again begin with this new episode for our Plan to Protect podcast. Today, we're talking about a topic that my children have opened my eyes to see and understand. So it's very applicable for them to be on this podcast, especially Tori, because she has really taught me so much about this topic about mental illness. Tori is joining us today from Kenya, Kijabe, Kenya. She serves at Rift Valley Academy as her child protection coordinator. And prior to that, she served 7 years as our director of training at Plan to Protect. So, Tori, welcome. It's good to see
Thank
you
you.
so far
Thank you.
away.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here today.
I love working with you.
Oh, that's sweet. Me too.
Today, the topic we're going to unpack is around mental illness. Now, I've learned so much about this, and I said so much of it was from you and your siblings, but things have really changed over the years. And I saw on the news just recently that according to Pacific Oaks College, a recent studies reveal an undeniable problem. Gen Z is the most depressed and anxious when compared with other generations. And as we all know, I'm a boomer. A significant percentage of Gen Z individuals report experiencing symptoms of depression and anxiety. The American Psychological Association report in October of 2024, issues from immigration to sexual assault are causing significant stress among members of the Generation Z, those between ages 15 and 21 years of age, which is young to experience so much stress and anxiety. This is a result of mass shootings, topping the list of stressful collected and current events. Gen Z members are also more stressed than adults overall about other issues in the news, including 53% of all Gen Zs versus 39% of all other adults report that their source of anxiety and stress are related to sexual harassment and assault. And we're talking about safeguarding today. The generation is also significantly likely, 27% more than other generations, including millennials, which you are one, 15%, and Gen X's 13% to report their mental health as fair or poor, the survey found. They are also more likely, 37% more, along with millennials, 35%, to report that they have received treatment or therapy from a mental health professional, compared with 26% of Gen Xers, 22% of baby boomers, and 15% of people that are older than boomers. Now, did I get that correct? Are you a millennial?
Yeah.
Okay. So I know that you and your siblings have encouraged me to consider therapy because of some of the work that I do with Plan to Protect and safeguarding, victim advocacy, and investigations. I know it's been really beneficial for me, and I probably entered into it a little bit slow and hesitant, and it caused me even a little bit of anxiety even to consider going to a therapist. But
Yeah.
I'm so glad that you did. So, Tori, um, why is this topic so important for us to talk about?
Well, I mean, I think there's a ton of different reasons why this topic is really important. And I think some of the statistics you shared is part of that. I think I also have like a personal motivation about why this topic is so interesting to me and I think are so important and so valuable. And you kind of alluded to that. Um, but I think one of the things that the statistics show is like that we're seeing a lot of Gen Zs and millennials who are talking about mental health, but and that maybe those numbers are higher there. I mean, maybe this is controversial, but I kind of disagree a little bit with the American Psychological Association, which, like, okay, I'm
That's
just Tory.
okay.
But I think the reason I disagree is I just think that mental health is becoming less of a taboo topic. So younger generations are more willing to talk about what they're struggling with. They have the words, they have the ways to describe what they're going through. That counseling is not this like dirty word where I don't know about you, but when you were growing up, did people talk about mental health? Did they talk about going to counseling? Did they talk about struggling with anxiety or depression or mental health concerns? Like, was that a thing?
I remember my mother and my friends' mothers, they were all on medication to help with stress and anxiety, but no one ever really talked about it. Maybe as kids, we talked about our mothers all on medication for anxiety,
Yeah.
but people did not willingly tell people they went to a counselor or therapist.
Yeah, it was definitely like more taboo. I even remember like myself growing up in high school, I had never really heard anybody talk about mental health or anxiety. Like you heard about like people who were like really bad, but you never really heard people like everyday people talking about this even as a millennial when I was in high school. But now I feel like people are talking about it more. So yes, maybe Gen Zs are reporting like significant more stress or more anxiety or more depression or more mental health concerns than ever before. But I think it's because it's not as taboo, which in my mind is a good thing. But I mean, this all brings me back to kind of why this topic is something that I'm so passionate about. It's because I struggle with my mental health and I have struggled with it for a long time. Since I was about 12 years of age, I think I had my first panic attack when I was 12. And growing up, nobody talked about it. Like nobody talked about counseling or mental health or anxiety. I didn't even know that anxiety was a thing. Like I was experiencing this like thing, but I had no word to describe it. And it wasn't until I like went away to university that I like was able to get a diagnosis and talk to counselors and get into counseling and really be able to like put a definition and a word and be able to describe what I was going through. So that was kind of like for me, when I got my diagnosis, it was kind of that like wake up call that this is an actual thing and it doesn't have to be taboo, that we can talk about it. For you, when was that point when it you kind of realized that this was like actually something that a lot of people were struggling with, or when did you realize that I was struggling with this?
I didn't, I don't think I realized, or your father realized, that you were struggling with this until you were well into university and you told us that you had been diagnosed with this. And I'd never even heard of the diagnosis before. So I had to do a lot of research on the topic. And I know it was heartbreaking for me to realize that you had been suffering for so many years and I wasn't aware of it. Now, you and I are pretty different. We have very similar work ethics and we share similar interests in work and we work together really well. But we're different. You're very much an introvert. You've been saying that you've been self isolating your whole life. And I'm an extrovert. I am fueled when I'm with people and energized when I'm with people. So we are different that way. So I always knew you were an introvert, a bit like your dad, but I never realized about the mental illness until you were in university and after the diagnosis. And then it pained me to know that you had been suffering that long in isolation and alone.
Yeah. I mean, the thing for me is I had been struggling with anxiety and panic attacks since like the beginning of high school and struggling with like panic attacks and anxiety that was getting progressively worse throughout high school to the point that I was sometimes having anxiety attacks like every day or 2 or 3 a day. And then when I went to university, it got worse. And there were times when I like actually couldn't leave my apartment to go to class and nobody really knew that. Like I wasn't telling anybody because I didn't really think I could tell anybody and I was afraid to tell anybody and I didn't actually even know what I was going through. So when I finally got a diagnosis of social anxiety and agoraphobia. And I came forward and told you and told the rest of the family and told friends and stuff like that. I know for you, it was heartbreaking, and that makes sense. For me, getting a diagnosis was actually really freeing, which I know maybe sounds a little bit twisted, but for me, it was freeing because it was like, oh, if there is an actual word for what I'm struggling with, it means that I'm not alone and that there are hundreds or thousands of people around the world who are also struggling with this. And I mean, the evidence shows that that is the case, that there are lots of people who are struggling. I mean, some who are struggling with anxiety and panic attacks or social anxiety like me or agoraphobia like me. But then there's lots of people who are struggling with lots of other mental health concerns. And I think knowing that I wasn't alone in that struggle was really freeing. And for some people, I think it can be really freeing. For others, I think it can be this like heartbreaking, devastating, like life shattering thing. And I think it could have been that. But because I had struggled for so long in silence and without getting the help that I needed, having a diagnosis was helpful because then it meant I could get the help that I needed. And I think when it comes to this whole idea of safeguarding, as we're talking about today, like, I think it's really important for us to like get over some of those taboos so that we can talk about it so people can get help. And also for us to like realize that mental health and mental illnesses and things like that do have a role in safeguarding. And it's important for those of us who are working in the safeguarding world to be aware of those things. So, how have you seen the role or understanding of mental health and mental wellness when it comes to safeguarding within your role?
Well, I've seen it intersect in a number of different ways. And I think because of the volume of people that you're talking about that have struggled with mental illness or struggle and hurt with anxiety, we do need to include it in our discussions and conversation around safeguarding. We don't want to cause further hurt and injury to people that are already being harmed. So yeah, our response when we discover that people are either being abused or being exposed to abuse and injury and harm, or even when people are telling their stories and have the courage to tell their stories of what is happening to them, our responses are so important, how we respond. So in the last couple of years, as I've been researching this so much more, and even through my master's and my doctoral study and my focus on trauma informed care, I think mental illness really comes into play. Um, so it touches a lot of the work that we do. And as you know, and as I know, um, compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, it can impact our
Mhm.
own experience of safeguarding. So we're also talking to all those practitioners out there that their mandate, their portfolio includes safeguarding. I just recently read in the news, I don't know if you saw it, but someone who was working in a large Canadian community organization, I won't name the organization, but someone who was serving in their safeguarding department actually has filed a lawsuit against the organization for the trauma that he experienced being a safeguarding director within their organization, the number of stories he heard, and that whole compassion fatigue. And he's filed a lawsuit against the organization because of the trauma he experienced. What about you? You do this all the time. You were telling me about stories even earlier this morning. Like, you must experience this even in your workplace.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think I saw this quote by the Canadian Mental Health Association where they said mental illnesses are health problems that affect the way that we think about ourselves, relate to others, and interact with the world around us. They affect our thoughts, feelings, abilities, and behaviors. And it's important to understand that mental illnesses are real illnesses. Like other illnesses such as diabetes or asthma, most mental health illnesses are episodic. That means that people have periods when they are well and productive, as well as periods when they are unwell and overall functioning is low. And that idea of it being a problem that affects the way that we think about ourselves, relate to others, and interact with the world around us is so key. So when we're talking about this like safeguarding idea, and we're talking about the people that we're working with, whether they're children, youth, or vulnerable adults, if they are struggling with their mental health, that's going to affect how they think about themselves, how they relate to others, how they interact with us in our ministries, in our programs, in our schools, in our communities. And then for us, those who are working in the safeguarding world, if we are struggling with our mental health as we have that compassion fatigue or like vicarious trauma from working with those who are struggling, that's going to also impact ourselves and the way that we think about ourselves, the way that we relate with others, the way that we interact within our roles as safeguarding leads, or for me, the child safety coordinator of Rift Valley Academy. Like it's going to impact that because it impacts our lives and the way that we interact with each other and the way that we interact with just the things that we do every day. And like it said at the end of that quote, like there are periods where we can be really well and we can be doing well in our roles or well in our lives, or kids can be happy and thriving, or vulnerable adults can be doing really well and be really productive. And then there are moments when like mental health and overall functioning can be really low, and it can really impact the way that they can do everyday life and the way that they interact with others. And I think that's why it's so important for us to be aware of this topic and then also have a plan for how to respond to it and how to interact with each other who might be struggling. um, I think you mentioned a little bit in as you were talking about the way that it impacts people, about how it can lead to maybe people feeling a little bit more vulnerable and stuff like that. So how have you seen that mental health impacts and the risks for somebody who is vulnerable, or how does it make somebody more vulnerable in some ways?
I think that they're very fearful to bring forward reports. They're hesitant to say when they don't feel safe. Um, they often will feel shamed or blamed or responsible or guilty. And so they carry that themselves instead of recognizing that what the actions that are happening, there. I was talking to a victim just a few weeks ago, and she said, I kept second guessing myself, thinking, is this me? Am I
Yeah.
misunderstanding the actions that are being directed in my way? Like, did he mean to touch me that way? What did he mean when he had that conversation with me? Why does he always want to be alone with me? So things like that, where people then feel that they're responsible for the actions, or they must be misreading them. So I do think it silences victims for sure. I also think that if we're not in that sweet spot, this is one of the things I learned in counseling, that whole idea of flight, fright, or freeze, when I am not at my best, and you know this because of just family life. When I am not in my sweet spot, I can re- resort to anger or frustration, irritation. Um, my responses are not kind. I may raise my voice. So I think that that also happens within, safeguarding that, whether we're in a classroom, interacting with 50 kids on a field trip, you know, that if we aren't at our best, then that's when harm can happen. Hurt people, right?
When people are struggling with their mental health, it's almost as if you are just life itself is you're just trying to survive. And so some of the other things that maybe you would normally have boundaries, or you would normally have things in place to protect yourself when you're going through hard things, when you are going through mental health concerns, those walls are like actually easier to crumble and can make you feel more vulnerable, or can create a situation of vulnerability. In the book Blossoms in the Valley: Emerging from the Depths of Mental Illness, which was written by Dr. Thomas Choi, a psychiatrist, he says that mental illnesses render the sufferers as easy targets for exploitation and abuse, and they are actually more vulnerable than most people realize. And I think about myself as a teenager who was really struggling with my mental health and with anxiety, and I was just feeling alone and like I didn't have somebody to talk to. I resorted to pretty bad like coping strategies sometimes. And I think even those coping strategies could lead to greater risk of like abuse or exploitation or things like that. So, for example, for me, one of my coping strategies was like to go on to online like chat rooms and talk to other people. But like you and I both know from like technology safety that like a lot of those online chat rooms and discussion forums are filled with predators or people who would want to target kids or teenagers. And so like even just that being an example of how like you are doing this coping mechanism of talking to people online to work through what you're struggling with, and then it can lead to that abuse or that exploitation of somebody who might want to harm you. And I'm sure you've seen it in your work with as a victim advocate of how sometimes like people go to pastors or counselors to talk to them about what they're struggling with, and then that like power differential creates this like situation where harm can happen. Can you talk about how you've kind of seen that work out in situations?
Well, often people will go to, as you said, a pastor for maybe pastoral care and counseling, but that pastor probably has not received professional training and education on counseling. They are not trained counselors. They're trained theologians. They've gone to Bible school or seminary, but they've probably only had one class or maybe two classes at the most on counseling. And they end up um, trying to identify with the person that they're talking to. So they start sharing their own personal stories and crossing boundaries they should never cross. And intimacy ends up as a result, and it's a slippery slope from there, that what started off as pastoral care in an office ends up to be either an emotional affair or, as you said, a power differential, a breach of authority, and ends up in sexual harassment and abuse and or clergy misconduct.
Yeah.
And
So
seeing that over and over and over again.
yeah, so it sounds like sometimes those coping strategies that people are using can lead to more risk. But then, even when they go and get help, because they're in a vulnerable position, then it could lead to the potential of being harmed or manipulated or things like that. So, it would be really important that those who are in the position to help people have those appropriate boundaries and understand how to hold those boundaries and create good relationships so that there isn't that potential of risk, or for organizations to make sure that they have things in place to protect those that they're working with who might be more.
Policies,
Mhm.
training, procedures, accountability. All those things are so important, that organizations put in place to create a structure and parameters for engaging with individuals so that people aren't further harmed.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it would be really important to have some kind of policies around that to ensure that it doesn't happen. So, like, what would be some of the policies that you would recommend in those areas? And then I can share some of the things that we're doing here at our VA to also protect those who have mental health concerns.
Well, we really recommend that people be referred to a professional counselor, someone who's licensed, someone who has had that education, that is a licensed therapist or psychologist or psychiatrist. So we would really recommend having a policy around referrals. Certainly, you can do pastoral care, and that could be a few visits with the pastor, but when it goes beyond a few visits and a few meetings, then they really should be referred to a professional. So that would be a policy I would be looking for. I would also want there to be good documentation in place. I know well, as I do that, your father is a pastor, and when he first started off in pastoral ministry, his supervisor, very first day, gave him a journal and said to him, Scott, document everything. You know, write down appointments that you go on, conversations that you have. So I think that good documentation, and just also making sure that the board is well aware of the interactions you're having. They don't need to know all the names of the people, but they need to know how much of your time and energy you're spending on things like pastoral care, counseling, or one on one mentoring, or coaching. So I think that leadership has to give permission to do those kind of one-on-one meetings. Where those meetings are held are really important. So
Mm.
identifying whether they're to be done during office hours, in an office, in a professional setting, with someone else in the building at the same time. I know your father is very careful about making sure that the blinds are open in his office so that there's clear sight lines, and that he positions the person that he's doing pastoral care with, so that they're not facing the door, but they are the ones that are closest to the door, so that they feel comfortable that they can leave if they need to leave.
Yeah. You mentioned mentoring, and that just struck a chord for me because at RVA, we do a lot of mentoring and we're encouraging students to get a mentor, like get a mentor, get a mentor. Do you have a mentor? And we have like a list of people who are willing to be mentors. And I think most staff at RVA are mentoring a number of kids. And it's been really important for us here to make sure that we have like really clear instructions in our training, like we have it in our policies, but also making sure that in our training, it's really clear to mentors, like where that tipping line is. So, like, what's the point at which, like, this mentoring relationship needs a referral? And the way that we've kind of communicated that with our staff is if it's harm to self or harm to others, or if it's any type of abuse, or if there's any concern of a mental health like health condition, that has to be referred. And we kind of like go through different scenarios, like if a kid says this, then how would you respond? And I think that that's been one of the keys for us, is making sure that our staff know what that tipping point is, because otherwise you might be mentoring and you never know when you should take it from that mentoring relationship and report it. Have you seen situations like that, or how would you describe what that tipping point is?
Yes, there should be clear statements that if anything like a incident of abuse or a disclosure of abuse or suspicion, or if it becomes intimate, boundaries are crossed, then you should be accountable to that. Tell your supervisor, refer that person to a professional. So exactly the same thing. And I think also, as you said, even the location of where you're mentoring, because the intimacy of a home where you're alone with someone, that that also could feel very unsafe to someone. So I think the more professional or public setting where you're stationary is very key.
Yeah.
But you also really want to protect people's identity. And I think confidentiality is so important because people have to feel safe. They won't share their mental illness, and the struggles they have if they don't feel safe, if they don't feel that's going to be in a confidential setting. So I think confidentiality is really important.
For sure. One of the things I love about our community is that because mentoring is so valued and so many kids are in mentoring and it's kind of just like expected, that we can have students meeting with teachers, dorm parents, mentors all over campus all the time. And so it doesn't feel like this, like, oh, they're meeting with a mentor, but it's just like, oh, they're meeting with their mentor and I'm going to meet with my mentor the next day. So, like, you see these, like, staff members who are sitting all over campus, obviously in public locations with their mentee, like working through things. And I think that that just creates this like community of like, this is what we do. So it's not, and it's private because they're having a private conversation, but they're like in public in view of others. And it creates that, I don't know, safe safeguarding element of it to make sure that those conversations are still able to happen in a confidential way, but also in a safe way too. Like we want to do both. We don't want to like sacrifice confidentiality for safety, and we don't want to sacrifice safety for confidentiality. Like how do those two meet together? And I think it's making sure you're doing it in those like open public places, but obviously like set apart from people if you need to. So like this group will meet with them in at a picnic table. I have a girl that I mentor every Thursday, and we meet like in one corner of the cafeteria that's like a little quieter. So like there's lots of other people walking around, but nobody else can hear our conversation. And that way she still has that like ability to come forward and tell me about what's going on in her life, but also in a safe way. So that if she was struggling, she could come forward.
So let me give you a case study here. If a student shares with their youth leader or a mentor that they struggle with mental illness, that they feel a lot of anxiety, that they are having trouble sleeping, um,
Mhm.
trouble studying, there's psychosomatic symptoms of nausea, um, and even have said that they have engaged in self injury. So they're sharing their mental health struggles with
Mhm.
their mentor. What would you want that staff member, that mentor, to do in that situation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, as I said, our like tipping point is harm to self or harm to others. And so, like in this specific scenario that you just gave, it's pretty clear that there's harm to self happening. So we would recommend that they report that. So we have incident reports that staff can fill out that immediately go to child safety or counseling, depending on what it is. Or they can come and talk to us, and by us I mean like our student wellness area, which would be our counselors, or child safety or student health or something like that. And what I always try to encourage staff is that you can ask us and like kind of consult with us and say like, hey, a girl that I'm mentoring or a boy that I'm mentoring said this, is that something that I need to report? And then it kind of takes the onus off of the mentor for having to be the one to like decide, but basically I'm just asking the question, and then based on what child safety or the counselors or student health says, then I'm going to fill out an incident report. And we just kind of really try to stress that like all of this is in order to protect that student and do what's best. And there's some situations where the counseling department might say, okay, thank you so much for sharing. Like, it sounds like the kid is doing okay, and you can just continue to mentor them, but let me know if anything else comes up. Or there might be situations like with self injury, for example, that is like an automatic like counseling referral, and our counselors are going to meet with them to work with them through that. So I guess it depends, but in most situations they should be filling out an incident report, or asking us if they should be filling out an incident referral. And again, it's that tipping point of like harm to self or harm to others or abuse. And in this situation, there's definitely harm to self.
Let's talk just a little bit about compassion fatigue,
Mhm.
vicarious trauma. Um, People ask me all the time, Melody, how do you keep doing what you're doing? How do you keep hearing these stories? I could never hear these stories all the time. And, faith is very, very important to me. And what I think has been the biggest game changer for me is I do have a group of people that pray for me every Monday, that I shoot out a quick email to and just ask them, for quick prayer requests around the work that I do. And I share with them when I am feeling that compassion fatigue. Your role is even more um, exposed to this, I think, because you can't tell people what is happening. You can't really have conversations with your friends or who you're having dinner with around reports that you're taking in. Um, you
Mhm.
carry so much of that on your own. So how do you deal with this? Because you already have a history of anxiety and mental illness, and the work you do could put such a load on you. And I know it because I'm your mom and we talk often that this does weigh heavy on your heart. And many days you do end up in tears. So, what would you say to people that are listening to this podcast around taking care of yourself, self care, when it comes to compassion fatigue?
Yeah, I think if you are in a safeguarding role, any kind of role, whether you're like the administrator you're at your organization or the trainer, or you're a victim advocate like yourself, or if you're the child safety coordinator like I am, and you're actually like dealing with and interviewing and coming up with care plans and all of that, like compassion fatigue is real. Like that point you get at where you have that sense of hopelessness or that irritability, or like you have less energy or you can't sleep or you want to isolate yourself, like all of those things can be part of that compassion fatigue. So it is really important to take care of yourself. And I think it's important to think through how you're going to take care of the different parts of yourself. So I don't know if this makes sense, but basically, compassion fatigue impacts you physically, emotionally, psychologically. And if you come from a faith community, it can also impact you spiritually. So I think if you know that it's going to impact those areas of your life, physical, emotional, psychological, and spiritual, to think through what are you going to do for each of those areas of your life to get the support that you need, to get the rest and recuperation that you need. So for me, like my emotional and psychological support that I need is meeting with a counselor. So I meet with a counselor at least once a month. Sometimes it's every single week. It really depends on how busy I am. Thankfully, I have a counselor like on call. And we meet to talk about what's going on because she holds that confidentiality and it gives me an outlet to get across the concerns that I have. But the physical health part of it, maybe it looks like taking 1 day a week and just doing no phone calls and no emails and just resting, and doing things that are going to help me feel physically healthy. Um, and so thinking about those different areas and going, what do I need? Okay, I'm going to need a break. I'm going to need time by myself. I'm going to need counseling and support. I'm going to need healthy food and time to sleep and time to take care of my body and my brain and my heart and all of that. And I think the most important thing with that is to take the breaks that you need. Because I don't know about you. Well, I kind of know a little bit about you, but we both are the kind of people who push through and continue to push and push and push and push, even to the brink of like basically we're like so exhausted that we're like dying. But what does it look like to take the breaks that you need ahead of time so that you don't get to that stage, so that you're not completely burnt out and that you're not completely at a place where you have nothing left to give?
I schedule a sabbatical once a month or once a quarter. Every
Yeah.
quarter, I try to take some kind of sabbatical, and that's very helpful for me. I know that you crochet and you do a lot of artistic things, and I know in December you um, sort of hid away in a retreat center for a few weeks in the UK, and I think that that was helpful in healing for you. Because, and spiritually, I think we both do a lot of journaling, and you even do some sort of creative journaling, which I think has been really helpful for you, and having good friends and people who will listen to you, um, and just sort of distract you from the heaviness. I know your
Yeah.
father, when I was a victim advocate and really busy in those couple of years, I was, you know, very, very busy as a victim advocate. I know your father always encouraged me to spend like 10, 15 minutes in solitude and silence and prayer before I took in another call.
I was thinking I wanted to share a book that's been really helpful for me in this too. It's called Try Softer, a fresh approach to move us out of anxiety, stress, and survival mode and into a life of connection and joy. And it's by Anandi Kolber. I might not be saying the name right, but we'll make sure that we link to it. But that's a book that has really been helpful to me. So I would highly recommend it. What does it look like to try softer in these areas so that we can be taking care of ourselves.
Yeah, I've read that book too, and I found it really beneficial.
So you've both been talking about self-care and taking care of your mental health, and we've been talking about how safeguarding is impacted by the mental health and mental illness that the vulnerable are dealing with, and how that can even create vulnerability. But Melody, you talked about an organization getting sued because they weren't potentially taking care of the mental health of the safeguarding experts that they had on staff. I guess Melody, as an employer who employs people who do safeguarding work and who are vulnerable to vicarious trauma, and Tori, as somebody who's on the front lines with safeguarding concerns. Tori, what would you tell your boss in terms of what you need and how they can support you? And Melody, how are you protecting the safeguarding experts that are in your care, who work for you? I think that's probably a really key conversation to have.
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, I think that if you have safeguarding people on your team, um, one of the key things that you can do to support them is pay for their counseling. Um, I think that counseling should be a part of your safeguarding budget, because a lack of being able to pay for that should never be the reason that somebody is not getting the counseling that they need. Like, let's just realize that this is a hard job. So if you have safeguarding coordinators or officers or whatever, and they've gone through something traumatic, like, pay for their counseling. Like, that should just be a base, I think, would be one thing. And another one is to, like, listen to them and get them the support that they need. So if they are feeling overwhelmed, if there's too much going on, if there's too much on their plate, and they're saying, hey, this is too much, I need help, to do whatever you can to get them the help that they need. And no matter how much workload there is, I think that this is the kind of job, when you're doing safeguarding, when you're on the front lines, that doing it by yourself is hard. And like, even if you're in a really small organization, it's still hard. Like, I work at Rift Valley Academy where we have almost 500 students, and it is a hard job to do by yourself there. I can't even in a church of 100 or a school of 200 or a community of 1,000, like, no matter what size there is, having a team is really important so that you aren't having to carry that heavy load. And so I would encourage employers or organizations or ministries or schools or whoever to think about not just having one person who's doing it, but to have a team so that they don't have to carry that load all on their own. So I guess my three things were: pay for their counseling, get them the help that they need, and then listen to them. So if they're saying they need help, or if they need a break, or they need your support, to actually listen to them in those areas, because just those things will go a long way in making this role more sustainable for people.
I
Do you have
would
anything?
add I do. I would add a few things to that, but also from the employee perspective, I think things that you can do. One is these individuals are professionals. They've invested in their um, professional development. Many individuals will have their masters or their doctorates. They will have they will have spent hours at conferences and reading books and learning about this topic. Listen to them, support them when they are doing an inquiry, when they are doing an investigation, when they make recommendations for care plans. Listen to them as professionals. Don't leave them out of that conversation. I think that's really important. um, it actually breaks my heart when I hear about safeguarding coordinators or people that have this as their mandate, where they're begging the board for support, a second person to work in the department with them. That person is so key. So I would agree. Put in your budget to expand the department as needed, and to be able to get that that safeguarding person, some help. Things we've done at Plan to Protect, because one is when I'm doing interviews with all of our staff, I talk to them about how difficult the work is and how we hear some pretty horrendous stories. And we hit some obstacles and naysayers. And I think just supporting people and having their back when they encounter naysayers is really important. And I absolutely try to have this back of my employees. The other thing is a couple of years ago, we added health benefits and made sure that we had that counseling available for our staff so they could access that. We also shifted our sick day policy and changed the title of it to a wellness day policy. So staff could take off a day if they felt that they were hitting a wall or needed a wellness day, a mental health day. And we shifted just our terminology from a sick day policy to a mental health policy or a wellness policy. So those are little things to do, and also to check in on them regularly. Check in on them, try to create time in the schedule for fun. And we try to do that, a plan to protect, where we'll do an escape room, or we go to a dinner theater or a boat cruise, or, mini pup. We try to do something that is just sort of fun, that is team building, just to laugh together. And there have been times, and I have been known that I turn on Taylor Swift really loud and do a dance-a-thon to shake it off. And for me, that has been very, very therapeutic. And I try to get my staff up to even do the dance-a-thon with me and shake it off. So, Tori, thank you so much for joining me for this podcast. Really, really appreciate it. Josh, appreciate the work that you are doing in producing these. If you have questions at all about what you heard today on this podcast, or if you've got ideas for future podcasts, please email us at podcast@plantoprotect.com. Podcast@plantoprotect.com, and we'd be happy. We answer all of the emails that come into us, and we'd love to hear from you. Anyway, thanks everybody. Appreciate you.